Yama. Good morning. My name is Simon Bronnett. I am the Dean and Head of Sydney Law School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Am I in the right place, Andy? Very good. Complete amateur at these things. Ini Kalawagan Mari Budyari Gadi Nurada, which in the land of the Gadigal, the people of the Gadi, means we meet here together on this beautiful land of the Gadi people, the Gadigal. And if you don't know what a Gadi is, there are many of them just here outside. If you look around, you'll see down the East Ave parade a lot of beautiful Gadi trees. They're indigenous to this area, and that's from which our indigenous First Peoples take their name. So very delighted today to welcome, I can't say welcome back because you were in the old law school, the old new law school, not the new law school, Georgia Dawson. This is a conversation with distinguished alumna. First I'd like to introduce Nicole Abadi, who will be the interlocutor today, herself a very distinguished alumna, 20-year career in law, practicing as a barrister in New South Wales, but also you never really escape Sydney Law School, been teaching international law and then moved into the literary world. And even though she's, in a sense, not on faculty, she kind of is, because we keep bringing her back to do lots of conversations over the past couple of years. So Nicole is one of the amazing #inspiring legal minds of Sydney Law School, who keeps engaging with us. She writes about books and things, other things for Good Weekend, and interviews writers at writers' festivals, including in Sydney Law School. But the main event today is Georgia Dawson. Congratulations again, winner of the 2023 Alumni Award for International Achievement. So Georgia, Freshfields Bruckhaus Deringer. Did I get that right? Kind of close enough. Very old law firm, 280 years. Is a senior partner and has a background in internal regulatory investigations, complex multi-jurisdictional litigation, compliance in anti-money laundering, anti-bribery and corruption, and human rights, an area after my own interests and heart. Great field to work in, and has done a huge amount of work across APAC, Europe, Africa and Central Asia. She obviously is a graduate not only of Sydney, but also University of Cambridge. She has numerous awards recognising her as an influential woman in finance in 2023, 22 and 21. Also recognised as the ALB Southeast Asia Law Awards Woman Lawyer of the Year. And it goes on, and you can read that in the bio attached to this event. Admitted to practice not only here in New South Wales, but in England and Wales and Hong Kong, and registered as a foreign lawyer in Singapore. First-class degrees, as you would imagine, from here too. And when she studied at Cambridge International Relations, interestingly, not law, because of course she's got a global vision, and that's what we'll be learning about, on a Chevening scholarship. So without any more from me, I'd like to hand the mic back to Georgia and Nicole. Away you go.
Thank you. Sorry, I better work out how to turn the microphone. Thank you, Simon, for that lovely introduction. I'd like to start our conversation, Georgia, by acknowledging the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like to add my enormous congratulations to Simon for that wonderful achievement. I believe that you were given the award last night, 2023 Alumni Award for International Achievement. And by the end of this 45 minutes, you'll know exactly why Georgia won that and what an easy decision it must have been. So you didn't always want to be a lawyer, I understand. You decided to do law after discussions with your careers counsellor, and then you started at Sydney Uni Law School here in the late 1990s. When you started law, you found that you really enjoyed it, and I wondered, what was it that you really enjoyed the most about it?
Well, it's a good question. I think we were really lucky, as is the case today, to have amazing lecturers who were the authors of textbooks or people who were regularly quoted as leading minds on particular areas. So you feel incredibly lucky to be learning from those people. So that was the first thing. I also love solving problems, and there's something about the law that gives you the tools to look at any given situation and apply them to come up with a solution to a particular problem. So I think it was trying to unpack what the relevant issues were and then using the legal tools to try and help come up with a solution that I particularly enjoyed.
You were here, as I say, in the late 90s, and when I say here, you weren't literally here, of course. You were in the old new law school, as Simon describes it, as I was, in Phillip Street. What was it like to study law there in those days? What are some of your memories from your days as a law student?
The building was tired, I think it's fair to say, and living underground like some rodent wasn't always ideal. But there's something about being in the city and seeing barristers leaving chambers, going to court, people in their gowns and wigs, that makes you feel like you're part of that community from the location there on Phillip Street. I think probably one of the challenges with the building was that there were limited places for people to gather. So it was either the library or the relevant common room. And you kind of grow up with it and you get used to it. And I only realised the big difference when I did a 6-month exchange in my final year of law to Queen's University in Canada. And that's in a place called Kingston on Lake Ontario. And it's a campus university, and most of the students live in halls of residence and attend the college, and so that there's a constant community of people around 24 hours a day. There are also 12 prisons, and so when you arrive as an exchange student, the student ambassadors sit you down and they say, we just need to let you know that in Kingston there are 12 prisons, which is why we're one of the leading criminal law schools. But it does mean that on these days of the week when prisoners are on day release, you really should be careful where you go. But it was something about that sense of people being around all of the time, which was more like here on campus, I suppose, than on Phillip Street, where people tended to come and go rather than spending the whole day hanging out.
I wanted to ask you about that exchange experience. I think there are probably a few people in the room that either are law students or are considering doing law. Would you recommend that experience of being an exchange student overseas?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm probably addicted to travel, I think. So I have scrimped and saved, or for short periods of time borrowed money from my parents and then had to work very hard to pay them back so that I could backpack all around the world. And to be able to go on a Sydney Law School program to Queen's with 3 other Australians was an amazing experience, because we had an automatic group of friends with the 4 of us, but also it's one of the first times that you're forced to recognise the similarities and the differences between different legal systems. So obviously we study it, I suppose, a bit throughout the degree, but being there, and I took some courses in legal issues relating to the Indigenous community in Canada and looking for the similarities with issues that we have here in Australia was really interesting. Hearing about the career paths and the progression points for the Canadian students, again, you're just learning about the fact that the world is different and people pursue their careers in very different ways. Also in Canada, and we get a bit of this, I think, in Australia, but Simon, you can tell me how much the world has moved on from when I was here. People had travelled coast to coast to go to university. Here, I think people tend to stay in the same state. So in Queen's, which is in Ontario, on the eastern side of the country, you had lots of people who'd come all the way from British Columbia or wherever else. So you had a really big mix of students. It was great. I flew out of Sydney on a day that was, I think, plus 32 degrees, arrived there and it was minus 32. And for those who haven't been to Canada, I'd like to say Australians are the best in the world, but I think honestly the Canadians are the nicest people on the planet, because Dad had taken me into a shop in Sydney to buy a thick coat to cope in Canada, was wearing that as I got off the plane to get on the bus that takes you from the airport into town. And I said to the bus driver, I'm staying at the youth hostel before I get a bus up to Kingston the following day. I think it's stop X on the bus route, but can you just let me know, because I don't want to miss the stop. And all the other passengers got on, and he said, fine, fine. All the other passengers got on, and he then got onto the microphone on the bus and said, ladies and gentlemen, there's a young girl from Australia on this bus. She's clearly freezing. Would anyone mind if we divert the route today so we can drop her right outside the youth hostel? And it was like that the whole time, people opening their homes and lives to us as international students. So yeah, if you get the chance, do it.
And Georgia, I love the fact that there's been quite a bit written about how you are one of a crop of highly talented Australian exports, Australian lawyers that have gone to work in London and around the world. And I know that you've talked about this and why Australian lawyers have been so successful overseas. And you've said that one of the reasons is because the education here is so good. And I wanted to ask you about the legal education you received here in Phillip Street at the law school, and what made it so good. What's so good about the Australian legal education that you had?
I think it's a combination of theory and practice that the courses are built around. So throughout my time at law school, you would both learn the cases and the relevant legal theories and how they had developed over time, but there were always opportunities to apply them to live situations. And then obviously the College of Law program takes you, depending on which way you want your career to go, but it gives you really practical experience of what it's like to draft letters, to interview a client, to produce a first draft of piece of evidence or whatever else. And I think the training in other countries is different. There's not so much focus on the practical application of the law. So I think Australian students are further up the readiness for work curve. And I think there's also something about the mindset of the can-do, let's just get on with it mindset of the Australian graduates that is really attractive to employers.
And I noticed that you did something else that I did. You worked as a paralegal at Freehills in your last years. And this goes a bit to what you were saying, I think, when the law school was in the city, being physically in the thick of it. But you worked as a paralegal in your last year or so at a law firm, Freehills, Herbert Smith Freehills. Was that a valuable thing to do? Were you glad that you did that?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a couple of part-time jobs during university, from swimming teaching for little kids through to working in the library stacking shelves. But I did 3 different law-related jobs. First paralegal job was at Middleton Moore and Bevans. They had the case that was British Telecom versus the New South Wales government, which at the time was one of the largest pieces of litigation in New South Wales, and they needed a large team of paralegals to do fairly tedious and painful doc review. So we would look through all of the evidence, and the first stage was to simply stick a barcode onto the bottom right-hand corner of every page. Then you had to scan each page of evidence and then enter into a database what it was that the document showed. So I'm not sure how much it advanced my knowledge of the law, but it gave me a really good understanding for what it's like to be a junior member of a team delivering on a massive project, and the really effective supervisors who took the time to sit down and say, okay, this is probably a pretty boring job, but this is where this job fits into this massive case, and this is why getting this bit right ultimately helps our client or makes us look good in front of court. So I did that. I also worked in one of the barristers' chambers doing research and drafting chronologies on cases, which I loved, both for the insights into what happens inside chambers, and the drama and the personalities was fascinating. And then the Freehills job, which was largely working on precedents, so in the knowledge management team, looking through the different contracts or draft documents and coming up with the standard forms, which again, as I've progressed through my career, I think hopefully having those types of experiences gives you a better sense of what's involved for all the different parts of a business in producing a good outcome for a client, rather than having a maybe more linear track just through being an associate through to a partner.
And then something really caught my eye towards the end of the degree, and you did a double degree, arts law, you majored in government and history as part of the arts degree.
Yep.
I was interested in 2002, you went to Vietnam where you worked on what's been described as a law-related aid program. What was that, and was that connected to Freehills, or just tell us a bit about that, what you
No, it
did and
wasn't.
how you got there.
It was an Australian government-funded project through the aid arm of the Australian government, at that foreign aid arms, which is AusAid. And you could apply to work on a range of different projects across APAC. And they were typically technical skills transfer type roles throughout the Pacific or in parts of Asia. And so I applied for the one in Hanoi in Vietnam. And at the time, Vietnam was pivoting from a command economy to more of a market-facing economy. And they were looking at ways to train lawyers and judges, as well as the different levels of government, about the rule of law, how that was going to play a role in the economy as the economy started to become more externally facing. So I don't speak Vietnamese, still don't. I've got some limited Vietnamese. But my role was to go in and help effectively an NGO that was linked to Hanoi National University that was running the education and law reform programs, and to help them devise the programs from commune level government through to the National Assembly. And I got to go with the NGO colleagues out to the communes to run the training, and sat and just observed. But it was often run mid-morning, so that the relevant commune officials would have been out in the fields working in the paddies, come in to have their training about things like water rights, domestic violence, etc., topics of law that were relevant to the local community, and then they would go back out and continue working in the field. And then it was, the next provincial level of government, and then ultimately the National Assembly as well. And I got to lecture a couple of times at Hanoi National University, and was asked to talk about legal ethics and what it's like working as a lawyer in Australia. And at the end of every lecture I gave, it was opened up for questions. And I thought I'd done a good job coming up with some interesting, thought-provoking topics. But I think on every occasion, the only question I was asked was, how much am I paid? So I clearly wasn't inspiring.
You went to Cambridge and did an MPhil in International Relationship, a Master of Philosophy, 2002 to 2003. So I saw, as I say, you'd done government and history in your arts degree. My question was the same as Simon's. Why not an LLM, a Masters of Law? Were you thinking of, having had that experience in Vietnam, were you thinking at that stage of maybe moving away from the law?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't put words in your mouth. The question
It's
is...
a leading question.
Yes, I'm sorry. The
you're
question
right.
is, why a Masters? Why the MPhil in International Relations rather than a Masters of Law?
I was considering pivoting to something that was more government work, and had applied for a position within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and gone through the process and had a job offer there. So I thought that this would be
Before you went to Cambridge?
I think the job offer came through while I was at Cambridge, but went through that process. So yeah, I was thinking at that point of pursuing something in the diplomatic arena. And it was a great program.
You finished it, and then in 2004 you started at Freshfields. So what caused the pivot back to law?
I could probably give a grander explanation, but it really boiled down to meeting my husband at Cambridge, who is English and had a job with the British government in foreign affairs. Right. And it was going to be easier for us to continue the relationship if I went back to law.
Okay. So in 2004 you start in Freshfields in London, working in litigation and dispute resolution. And you have 5 years in London and then 7 years in Hong Kong. What sort of work were you doing, and how did you enjoy legal practice?
It was amazing. My work at Freehills, I had a fantastic mentor supervisor who, here in Sydney, who was incredibly exacting and marked up every piece of work I did with masses of red pen, and I still have the first piece of work I did that had no red pen on it, and it simply said, "Dear sirs, please find enclosed." that was it, but I finally got there. In the practice that we had here in Australia, it was predominantly domestic focused work. I think I had one case that was cross-border relating to East Timor. And what I loved about going to London was that the work was multi-jurisdictional, or at least cross-border in every single case. So within the first couple of days of arriving at the Freshfields London office, I was put on a case where the firm, before I had arrived, had investigated a significant fraud on the state finances in Brunei, acting for the government to try to uncover where the funds had gone. And it turned out that it was the Sultan of Brunei's youngest brother, Prince Geoffrey, who had taken, at the time, $250 million or pounds, can't remember. There'd then been a settlement agreement entered into where the relevant assets that he'd purchased with all of that money were to be transferred back. The firm had handed the file back to the government and said, you can go and enforce this settlement and get in the assets. And I think 4 years later, they hadn't made much progress. So they came back to the firm and said, can you help us get all of these assets back? So Prince Geoffrey, with the money he'd taken out of the Ministry of Finance, had purchased hotels, boats, cars, works of art, jewellery,
like a James Bond
palaces.
movie.
It was. So the facts were truly spectacular. So we had to get freezing orders in different countries all around the world, go through the local court enforcement processes. So all of that was technically really interesting, and working with lawyers in different countries. But the fact that you were dealing with some of the most expensive artworks or incredible palaces or whatever else was also a bit more fun than some of my other cases. So I did those types of cases, a lot of banking litigation, banking regulatory investigations in London. And then 2008, I had our first son, and we decided in 2009 to move to Hong Kong. So the financial crisis had a pretty devastating effect on the environment in London. Do we need to exit the building? And I think it might be the alarm, or maybe it's I can move the microphone up. So in 2009, we moved to Hong Kong because at the time, China was...
I want to just pause for a moment, Georgia.
There we go. In 2009, the Chinese market was booming, and the work in Hong Kong was fascinating. And so in Hong Kong, in London, the cases were really interesting, but many of particularly the banking work was, a particular financial instrument and a contractual dispute about the rights and wrongs of people's conduct, and relatively genteel types of disputes. And then you went to Hong Kong, and it was like somebody had driven a truck through the law types of cases with fraud. And
what do you mean by that?
well, the law at that particular point in time was a relevant consideration to business, but it didn't dictate.
Interesting.
Okay,
because I was going to ask you what differences did you notice practicing in Asia, in particular in Hong Kong, from practice in London?
Yeah, so the facts on the cases were always fascinating. So it would be massive fraud cases, or a contract that quite clearly between an international investor and a counterparty within the region, where the contract just became completely irrelevant once signed, and people would act contrary to the terms of the contract. So always fascinating types of work. But in that period post-financial crisis, I'd say 80% of my practice was financial litigation and regulatory work.
And I read, we're going to get, of course, to the point at which you become managing partner, but I read that you hadn't always had that ambition in your mind. So I wonder, as you started at Freshfields, as you were building up your career as a litigator, what were your career aspirations at that point?
I don't know. And this is a point I often make when junior lawyers say, do you have advice for us? And the advice I often give is to be a bit more deliberate and proactive about the development of their careers. My career kind of happened to me. It might now looking back,
looks pretty good on paper,
like I had a very clear path and was diligently pursuing it. But I really wasn't. I love doing new things. I love when a new case comes in still, and you've got to try and unpick it all and understand things. And I think I was simply focused on learning as much as I could and doing the best possible job that I could, hoping that someone would notice that I was doing a good job, and then I would be promoted. And that works up to a point, but I think some people are more thoughtful about how they develop their careers, and they'll say, as a litigator, okay, I've drafted pleadings, but I haven't done a cross-examination, and they talk to their supervisor and say, please, can I have that next opportunity, and I probably wasn't as focused on that. So I really was just wanting to do the best possible work and to be treated fairly, and for that work to be recognised, as opposed to having an ambition to become the senior partner of the firm.
And I wondered if you could give us some insights into what are the qualities really that a good litigator needs. What qualities, what attributes do you need to be a really good litigator?
I think you need to be incredibly organised, because the scale of the cases these days, particularly the ones we work on, are enormous. And so you've got to have quite an orderly approach to things so that things don't get lost and this enormous project runs well. You have to have strong communication skills to be able to obviously make the case. But you've got to be a really good listener, because I think when you're interviewing witnesses, particularly in a cross-cultural context, unless you're really thoughtful about how you ask the questions and looking for facial expressions or other indicators, you can get the wrong sense of what the real story behind a particular case is. So listening, I think, is incredibly important. You have to be tenacious, because litigation, regrettably, takes a long time, and so you've got to maintain the enthusiasm and the desire to win for your client over years, which is not always easy.
So you said that you hoped that somebody would notice you. They did. In 2012, you were made the managing partner in Asia, and you held that role till 2020 when you became the senior partner of the firm. So let's talk about the time as managing partner in Asia. How did you enjoy that first real... you'd obviously already been made a partner by then, but how did you enjoy that first real significant leadership role?
So I became a partner in 2012, and I was on maternity leave at the time and came back to work in time for the date when being a partner would take effect. And that was a significant jolt, coming out of your mind and your focus being something completely different into trying to focus on building a practice and building a name for yourself. And I had twins, so was...
And you had one small child already.
And so there were three at that... Three under three, so that was...
3 under 3, I'm just going to repeat
easy
that.
at that point. And I was a partner for, I think, maybe 3 years before I was then asked to be the Asian managing partner. I found it really hard, I'll be honest, when I was first asked to do it. I was quite...
How many lawyers were you responsible for?
Lawyers, a couple of hundred in Asia, and partners around 30.
In Asia?
Yeah, and very young compared to those that I was then put in charge of managing. And I hadn't been prepared for or guided on exactly what the role entails. So business planning, budgets, how to do performance reviews of people who are 15, 20 years your senior, all those types of things. So I was probably...
You were young.
Like a deer in the headlights.
You were in your 30s then?
Yeah. I think, yes. You might... Yeah, I think I was. I don't think I was yet, late 30s or maybe just 40, I can't remember. But it was quite difficult. And so there were a couple of more senior partners who kindly stepped in and mentored me and provided me advice on, you need to think about this and you need to think about that, and this is how you should present things, because there's a massive amount of advocacy and influence in these roles. In law firms as partnerships, it's not like a corporate structure where you have somebody in a senior role and you just say, this is how it's going to be, and then the organisation implements it. It's about persuasion and influence. So they were very kind in the amount of time that they dedicated, but no, to begin with, massively overwhelmed.
And you did that for 8 years, 2012 to 2020.
I think it was probably 2015 to 2020, yes, about
2015,
5 years.
Yes.
4 or 5 years.
Now, I want to ask you, so you are elected senior partner of the whole firm, the whole worldwide 280-year-old firm. It's in September 2020. Now, I understand that these elections happen every 5 years. When did you decide to throw your hat in the ring? And tell us a bit about how you campaigned for that, and how the process of election works. Much as you're allowed to say. It's fascinating to see from the outside.
Yeah, I think decided to throw my hat in the ring 24 to 48 hours before the deadline.
Wow.
because I was really hopeful that someone else would run. The firm was, we have them every 5 years, and they're typically a contested election, and this one was looking like it wouldn't be. And I did.
Meaning no one was putting their hand up.
Only one person was, and I thought it was probably, given all of the change that came through COVID, ideally you'd have a debate around how do we need to change and develop in response to that, and how do we meet the competition, etc. So I rang a number of people and said, surely you'll run, surely you'll run, surely you'll run. And everybody said no. And I have a now 12-year-old daughter who was always desperate to become the class captain or class rep at her school in Singapore at the time. And I would say to her, you have to stand, because they used to have to stand up and make a little speech about why they should be the class rep. And she never got it, but each time she would try again. And I thought, how can I give her that advice that she has to have a crack when I'm sitting on the sidelines? So 24, 48 hours before you had to send your name in to the partnership secretary.
And it was just between two of you then?
And then it was an election between the two of us. I've never done anything like it. I don't know how politicians do it all the time. It's we've got 400 odd partners globally.
And do they all vote?
Yep. Compared to dealing with an electorate or in a presidential election, the amount of energy you have to bring to every conversation when you're pitching your proposal is significant. Your practice continues alongside this global campaign.
Do you get any allowance for that? Are there any reduction in your hours you have to bill in that time? No.
It was during still pandemic time, and so the one benefit, I think, to be able to manage both was that it was all conducted virtually. So historically,
because you were in Singapore,
in Singapore. So, but historically, those who were running would travel around the world and meet with the partnership to make their case. So this was all on screen, trying to make a connection with very senior partners, many of whom I'd never met in person before.
And the firm, am I right about this, Freshfields itself, and I'm not going to attempt the pronunciation of the German firm, but Freshfields itself had only a couple of years before, merged with a big German law firm, so it was even more international. Well, I guess was that the first time since that merger that there'd been an election?
No, the big mergers with Bruckhaus and Deringer were in 2000.
Right, okay.
So it was 20 years later, yeah.
Okay.
It's quite hard. I'm very passionate about the firm and I want it to be better. And, as an owner of the business, you've got a vested interest in trying to improve the organisation. But putting yourself forward to the partnership and saying, pick me to lead the organisation was a unique experience.
You've received, obviously, because you got the job, you received a lot of support and encouragement from people who had always supported you and from others as well?
Yeah, definitely. And that made a difference because I think most people, maybe not everybody, is inclined to doubt themselves. And so having people who just push you to say, we think you can do it, there's no reason why you can't have a go. And I ended up thinking, I'll roll the dice and see what happens. I could go down in flames and it will be very public, or maybe this will work out. And then when they rang, the chair of the board equivalent of the firm rang with the election outcome, I had my little script of, thank you very much, I'm pleased I tried.
Did you have the acceptance speech prepared?
No, I did not. I absolutely was convinced that we would lose. First woman, first litigator, first person in Asia.
Yeah, I wanted to make that point. I saw
significantly younger, so I just thought there was no chance.
I saw that in some of the writing. They were saying not only that your firm is known as one of the Magic Circle London firms, and it was the first time that a Magic Circle, one of the really big firms, had been led by a woman. But I was interested to read in some of the articles that they said it was also that you were a litigator where usually senior partners came from M&A or banking and finance. Yeah. And when you got the job, you said that you received emails from all over the world congratulating you. Tell us about that.
I've never experienced anything quite like it. My inbox exploded with predominantly women, but also men who wrote to say that they had daughters who were coming through the law with these wonderful, and I probably get a bit emotional when I think about it, but really wonderful messages saying how pleased they were to see this change, because it was an indication that, for the large numbers of women in the profession, that there was the opportunity to progress to senior roles.
So there's one article that caught my eye, as I mentioned to you, and I just can't resist mentioning it. We're not otherwise going to talk a lot about gender because you're here as a leader in your own right, not because of what gender you are. But I couldn't resist asking you about this. You got an enormous amount of media attention, more than you expected, I gathered, because you were the first woman to get this gig. And there was one article that was very gendered. And it started, and I shouldn't say no surprises, but no surprises. It was the Times newspaper, and the article opened by saying that when you were stressed, one of the things you liked to do to relax was to bake with your kids. Okay, maybe that's all right, but to open the article by describing your election as a legal bake-off seemed to me a little inappropriate. And the fact that the article ended with a subheading, vital statistics, seemed to me particularly inappropriate. How did you feel getting that sort of press?
So I wasn't prepared for the press interest. Obviously, we have a PR team and there were external advisors to the firm during the election, but emotionally, maybe, I wasn't prepared for it, largely because I didn't think I would be the headline. That article, it's disappointing, I think. It could have been an opportunity to present a different message to the women readership, and that opportunity wasn't taken by the journalist. Others wrote more helpful articles.
So one of the really, described as one of the pillars of your campaign, which I thought was really lovely, and something that you have really implemented. You have an absolute passion for diversity and inclusion, and you made that, as I say, one of the very strong pillars of your campaign. One of the things, I mean, you've done it in so many ways. I'm just going to focus on two, on women and the LGBTI community. With women, you have said that your aim for your firm is absolute gender parity, and you've put in various measures to help achieve that goal. Tell us a bit about those measures.
Sure. My job as the head of the firm is to ensure that after 280 years we continue to be relevant in front of market and that we have the best legal talent. You can't do that unless you're trying to get the most diverse group of talent across the market. You can see, going back to where I started on problem solving, you need people who come to a particular problem from a range of different perspectives. So it's strategically important to the firm's future that we have a diverse set of lawyers within the firm. So that's why I prioritised it. On women and the LGBT plus community, the firm has had many programs and initiatives over many years, and we were certainly starting to see progression of talent within the organisation. But when you look at the number of female law students coming out of law schools, and then those that were joining the firm but maybe then not progressing or staying beyond senior associate, clearly something needed to be done differently. So I said in the campaign that I wanted to set targets rather than quotas, and that would, for gender, that would require a minimum of 40% of our new partners to be women. And for every year since then, we have exceeded that target. And depending
How have you done it? What have you done? What are the measures that you've implemented that have enabled you to achieve that target?
Well, I think probably all that work that was done before I came was kind of crystallising as people move through the organisation. So I'm kind of standing on the shoulders of all of that work. But I do think a lot of it is you have to drive the necessary management focus. So you have to be able to say to the practice group leader for the corporate department, why don't you have, if you've had 50% female candidates good enough to come into the department straight out of law school, and they've stayed for a few more years, why is there not 50% still at senior associate level or at council level? What is going on? And then that requires each of the departments to have to look at their career development, their feedback, their training for talent as it's coming through the organisation. And if a diverse slate doesn't come through, then there's a very detailed conversation about why is that the case. There's, explain why we don't have the talent coming through. So I think last year was 48% women. This year will probably be the same or better. So it is, over time, it will make a difference to the makeup of the firm, which is globally around, I think we're about 28% women at the moment. So there's still a lot of road to go. On the LGBT plus community, I have had an uncle who recently passed away who was gay and was with his partner for many, many years, and you could see the inequality of treatment between their relationship, which was the same or longer than my parents' marriage, but they didn't have the same rights. And then in our family, wider family network, a lot of members of the LGBT plus community, and again, you're exposed to the inequality, and I guess that passion for human rights and the desire to achieve equality drove me to do largely pro bono and advocacy work to try and improve the situation.
That's something I wanted to ask you about. I know that you are passionate about the pro bono work that you do. Would you like to give us an instance, and maybe that's a really interesting one to talk about. Tell us about some of the pro bono work that you've done with the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, sure. So I think my pro bono interest started here at Sydney University, working at Redfern Legal Centre, where while still a student, you feel like you're able to use your then very limited skills to help people with things that are incredibly difficult or overwhelming for them, but you can step in and help with filling in forms or dealing with a tenancy dispute or whatever else the types of work that we had. And it was great to feel like you were making a difference. On the LGBT plus work, it's been things like in Hong Kong, there's a very tough refugee application process, and the success rate for people to be granted refugee status is incredibly low. So the initial decision is typically no, and there's then an appellate process, and your ability to succeed on the appeal is also incredibly low. But we ran a number of cases, largely for members of the LGBT plus community from Africa who were escaping persecution from different African countries to go through the appeal process, and were successful. So we are within the less than 2% success rate in giving those people the chance to start a new life in Hong Kong.
Didn't you create some sort of precedents or something that could be used by the firms within Hong Kong?
We did. Within the firm, we have a large technology team and incredibly talented, more junior colleagues who can produce apps, things that I will never be able to do. And so I thought there must be a way for us to produce an app for refugee applicants so that if they're in there having their interview with the relevant government officials in Hong Kong, they can just quite easily see the steps that they need to follow and the rights that they have on their phones. And then we had it initially in English and Cantonese and then translated into a range of other languages. So it was a cross-disciplinary team of lawyers on the substance, technologists and project managers who produced an app which is now used by the NGOs that we work with on the refugee work.
Final question, I can't resist because of my current career in books. You've said that your favourite book is Leo Africanus by Armin Malouf, not one that I know. What's it about and why do you love it?
Oh gosh, it's been a while since I read it. I don't know that I could give you a chapter and verse on it. It is beautifully written. The imagery is exotic and evocative. And my youngest son is called Leo as a result.
Thank you so much, Georgia, for speaking to us. I'm sorry we don't have time for questions. We only had 45 minutes and we just knew there was so much to discuss. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Georgia, for speaking to us. And congratulations again on an absolutely exceptional career. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you do with the next few decades.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you for being kind in your questioning as well.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
So at Sydney Law School, we are obviously incredibly proud of our alumni community. You can see just some of the strengths and the leadership and the thought leadership that is involved. So please join me once again in thanking Georgia. And if you have any questions about the law school or about the building, we've got the Dean here, we've got various other members of staff, please come and have a chat. We'd be delighted to have you either reacquaint yourself or join us at some point in the future. So please thank us and thank Georgia.